gospel reading today is from John chapter 18, verses 33 through 37. Then Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate replied, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priest have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate asked him, "So are you a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
And will you bow with me in prayer? O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. And let all God's people say, Amen. So in the church calendar, today, this last Sunday before the season of Advent, is always called Christ the King Sunday. And unlike some other special Sundays and seasons of the church year, Christ the King Sunday is not one of those truly ancient traditions of the church. I learned by reading a sermon on Christ the King Sunday by Bishop Will Willimon that Christ the King Sunday was created in 1925, not quite 100 years ago, by Pope Pius IX. And it was intended as essentially a political witness to the world in that time. If you know your history, in 1925, Mussolini had already been the leader of Italy for 3 years. Meanwhile, in Germany, a racist rabble-rouser called Hitler had been out of prison for a year and was beginning to increase in popularity. And the Feast of Christ the King was the Roman Catholic Church's response to the rise of fascism in Europe, over against those who wanted to rule the whole world, over against those who wanted to divide people into good people and bad people, into us and them. Christ the King Sunday asserts that there is in all of the world only one king. King of Aryan and non-Aryan people, king of party members and non-party members, king of liberals and conservatives. And that one king was not Mussolini, and that one king was not Adolf Hitler. That one king was Christ, and only Christ. In the words of a German Protestant pastor shortly thereafter, Martin Niemöller, in words that landed him in prison, he said in German, "Christ ist mein Führer." You see, it is a religious statement. It is a moral statement. But it's also, let's face it, a political statement, and one that might be needed in our world today, that Christ, and only Christ, is our King. Several years ago, one of my friends on Facebook posted something in the spring around the time of high school homecoming feasts, and I couldn't remember who it was. I went back and tried to find it on Facebook, but it's lost to time, or at least it's lost to my capacity to search on Facebook. But I still remember the gist of what she posted. She posted 2 newspaper stories about homecoming kings side by side, and then she made a comment underneath. One of those news stories was about a young man who was crowned homecoming king, and he must have taken it as license or entitlement, because that same night he went out and got drunk and he sexually assaulted 2 young women. The other story was about a young man who was elected homecoming king, but he allowed another student, a student with Down syndrome, to go through all of the ceremonies on his behalf. And underneath these 2 stories My friend wrote these words: there are kings, and then there are kings. There are kings, and then there are kings. That is a perfect summary of today's gospel reading, where Jesus and the Roman governor Pilate have this extended conversation. The first thing that Pilate says to Jesus is, "Are you the King of the Jews?" In all four Gospels, those are the first words that Pilate speaks to Jesus. "Are you the King of the Jews?" Or as the Greek worder might suggest, as Pilate looked at this humble Galilean peasant, he might have been saying, "You are the King of the Jews?" You know, really that's all that Pilate wanted to know. Did this man, Jesus, pose some kind of a threat to Roman rule and authority or not? And if he didn't, well, then he was really just a religious problem for the Jews to sort out themselves. And effectively, Pilate decides that Jesus does not pose this kind of threat, because remember, Pilate tries to cut him loose. In his part of this conversation, Jesus neither fully accepts the title of king, nor does he completely deny that he is a king. When Pilate asks, "Are you the King of the Jews?" in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus immediately says, "You say so." In other words, he's saying, well, king is your word for what I am, not my word. Here in John's Gospel, Jesus first responds to Pilate by saying, "Are you asking that on your own, or did somebody put you up to it?" And when Pilate persists, finally Jesus says, "Look, my kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my followers would be fighting to set me free." In other words, Jesus is saying, yeah, I'm a king, but I'm not the kind of king that Pilate expects. I'm not the kind of king that anybody expects, because there are kings, you see, and then there are kings. In Jesus' time, Roman rule and oppression was long and well established in what we call the Holy Land, but there were always Jewish people who were pushing back against the Romans, always Jews who were trying to overthrow Roman rule. In fact, just a generation after Jesus, the Romans got tired of Jewish uprisings, and they clamped down. And one of the things they did is they completely destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, and it remains destroyed to this day. And in Rome, you can still go and see the Arch of Titus. And one of the artistic panels on the Arch of Titus is there on the side of the screen. It's the Romans carrying the sacred objects off from the temple in Jerusalem. In Jesus' day, though, there were different groups of Jews who responded to Roman oppression in different ways. First of all, there were the scribes and Pharisees who essentially decided they were going to wait the Romans out. They were going to wait for God to come and intervene. They were going to wait for God to send the Messiah to kick the Romans out. So they were kind of passively waiting for God to do something. Second, though, there were the zealots, or the sicarii, which literally means dagger men. They advocated violent resistance to Rome. Today we'd call them guerrilla fighters or freedom fighters. And just as an aside, this name Sicarii sounds an awful lot like Judas Iscariot, doesn't it? And so some scholars believe that Judas was actually a Sicarii, and that he betrayed Jesus because Jesus wouldn't engage in armed warfare against the Romans. Don't know that, but that could be. So there were the scribes and Pharisees who were simply waiting for God to do something. There were the Sicarii and the zealots who did something violent against Rome. And finally, there were the Sadducees, and these were Jews who enjoyed special wealth. They had special privileges because they collaborated with the Romans. They cooperated with Roman occupation. So there's all of this going on. And then there was Jesus. Jesus had a completely different approach to responding to Roman occupation. See, Jesus understood you didn't have to wait for God to do something. Jesus understood that in his ministry, that in the ministry of the people around him, God was acting in the world already. That through a community of ordinary people, God was doing something powerful in the world. I mean, still the trappings of Roman imperial authority were all over the place. You couldn't miss them. But Jesus said it doesn't matter, because God has defeated the Romans already, and only God is really in charge. And therefore Jesus urged his disciples, his followers, not so much to strike back against the Romans as to kind of defy the Romans in two ways. He urged his followers to defy the Romans by acting as though only God mattered. As though the governor, the emperor just don't matter, only God matters. And he encouraged them to form these alternative communities, later called the church, that were based not on fear of the Romans, not on capitulating to the Romans. They were based on sharing and equality and love. See, I think that's what Jesus meant when he said, my kingdom is not of this world. He meant my kingdom is not based on human worldly values. My kingdom is based on the values of God. You can see what kind of king Jesus was by simply reading through the Gospels and seeing what Jesus did. So, for example, in John chapter 4, Jesus has this extended conversation with a person by the side of a well, even though he was this relatively privileged Jewish man, and she was a despised foreigner Samaritan woman. They should not have been talking to each other, but you see, there are kings. And then there are kings. In John chapter 6, Jesus comes across this group, you might say this caravan of thousands of desperate, hungry people. The disciples are afraid and want to send them away. And remember what Jesus does? Jesus fed every single one of them. There are kings, and then there are kings. In John chapter 7, Jesus encounters a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery, and he takes her side over against the government authorities who want to condemn her and employ the death penalty against her. You see, there are kings, and then there are kings, right? In John chapter 13, Jesus takes a towel and he ties it around his waist, and he gets down on his hands and knees and he washes the disciples' filthy feet, work that was usually reserved for a slave or a servant. You see, there are kings, and then there are kings. In John chapter 18, when the soldiers come to arrest Jesus, Peter decides to try to protect Jesus with a sword, and Jesus says, put that thing away. Violence is not the answer. There are kings, and then there are kings. And after Jesus died and rose from the dead, the first thing he does is he goes back to Peter, this man who had betrayed him not once, not twice, but 3 times. Peter had let Jesus down in his hour of need, and Jesus forgives him and restores his relationship with Peter. You see, there are kings, and then there is Jesus. And you see, whenever we come across situations like this, as loyal subjects of Jesus Christ, we always know how we ought to act, right? I mean, when we come across foreigners or people that other people think are those of lower status, we know how to treat them, right? Because Christ is our King. And when there are thousands of desperate, hungry people on our doorstep, we know what to do, right? Because Christ is our King. And when other people call for the condemnation and death of other people, well, we know to object, right? Because Christ is our King. And when we ourselves feel like writing people off because they have just let us down one time too many, we'll correct ourselves because Christ is our King. You see, we are, you and I, we are that alternative community that is based not on fear, not on privilege. This community is based on sharing and equality and love. We are that community where Christ and only Christ is the King. Now, I'm aware that's a lot to hear on a Sunday morning so close to Advent. In fact, I pray that you will allow the gospel, that you will allow Christ the King to kind of challenge your thinking, to guide your behavior in the world. But Christ the King Sunday also answers this question: who ultimately is on the throne? Who reigns? Who's in charge here, we might ask. Pilate thought that he was in charge, didn't he? I mean, after all, he had all the might, all the authority of the Roman Empire behind him. But what Jesus knows and what we know is that Jesus was actually in control of this scene. Humble, forgiveness-giving, foreigner-loving, hungry people feeding, Jesus was the one who was in control. Now, you and I both know it doesn't always look like Jesus is control of this world, does it? In that sermon by Will Willimon that I read about Christ the King Sunday, he shared some things that were going on at Duke University where he preached. Just before he preached that sermon, he said that 2 students were raped on campus that week. He said that a prisoner escaped and held some people hostage nearby. He said that a student mysteriously died on a campus bus during the week before he preached. I mean, it's a lot, isn't it? And it kind of makes you wonder, well, who's in charge here? Nevertheless, Will Willimon says, nevertheless, when it feels like the world is kind of coming apart, when it feels like we are threatened and vulnerable, it's good to know who's sitting on the throne, isn't it? It's good to know that Christ is our King. And the truth is, I mentioned the things that were going on when Will Willimon preached, but there's always stuff going on, aren't there? I mean, there's always stuff going on. We all have our litany of sorrows. I've shared with you how my heart is weighed down that in this country there is a mass shooting almost every single day. That ought not to be, my brothers and sisters. I remember very clearly just a few weeks ago, we read 11 names here on All Saints Sunday, names of members and friends of ours. I remember very clearly praying over our church's prayer list this past week, and there are the names of 22 people who are dealing with cancer. And I'll tell you, this very afternoon, I'm going to Marysville to take part in a funeral service for a 15-year-old girl who took her own life. I baptized her November 2nd of 2003. And you sort of wonder, who's in charge here? Well, you see, when it feels like the world is coming apart, when we feel vulnerable and threatened, it's good to know who's sitting on the throne, isn't it? It's good to know that Christ is our King. And here's the truth. There will be more mass shootings, won't there? Nevertheless, Christ is our King. And next All Saints Day, we'll read more names, won't we? Nevertheless, Christ is our King. And I suspect that our church's prayer list will go on and on and on. And nevertheless, Christ is our King. The question is, who's in charge here? Well, Pilate thinks it's him, doesn't he? But we know better. We know that Christ and only Christ is our King.